So Anthony Joshua has apparently taken it back to basics. He's uploaded a couple of pictures of himself laying into a tree with an axe with a caption, "Back to basics." Now this is a little bit cliche. We've kind of seen this over the years. If you watch the Rocky films or the Creed films, there's almost this cliche of fighters when they're down and out, when they're coming off of a loss, they go back to the old school methods. They strip away all the scientific training, all the luxuries, and they go back to these kind of primitive old school methods as a way to rebuild back stronger, better than ever in time for their comeback. And yeah, we can poke fun at it and say, you watch Creed once and all of a sudden you're chopping down some trees. It's all fun and games, but I want to take this opportunity to get across what I believe is an informed opinion, because I'm sure a lot of you guys can tell I've been immersed in boxing for many years. I feel like I know the sport quite well. But some of you other guys who have followed the channel for a little bit longer will know that I'm very much into strength conditioning. It's something I'm very enthusiastic about. It's something I've been involved in for many years, and it is actually my career. I work in strength conditioning, so I see myself as being able to get across an informed opinion that is hopefully enlightening for you guys and informative and, of course, enjoyable. But I want to take opportunities like this because within sport, within many sports, but especially boxing, there are some myths and misconceptions, and sometimes just like a downright hatred and dismissal of strength conditioning for preparing fighters for their fights. So I want to kind of bridge the gap between the two worlds, which is being done. I work with some people who coach very high level fighters who you watch on TV, and they're doing an excellent job at dispelling a lot of those myths and getting fighters into tremendous shape and reshaping the perceptions that people have of strength conditioning, especially in boxing. So let's talk about this. But first, I want to preface it by saying that Hatman gave his views on this, and he made a very important point, and that is sometimes athletes and fighters, they do things like this purely as like a photo opportunity where they can upload some dramatic looking photos in the lead up to a fight to drum up some promotion for it and get people talking. And sometimes it's just for ego. They want to take a picture in a similar fashion to the fighters of the old of years gone by, and kind of get their one up there, you know. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that this is actually genuinely a part of Anthony Joshua's preparation for this fight, because I want to go into some of the strength conditioning and scientific underpinning of why someone may do something like chopping down a tree. So, to introduce you guys to strength conditioning, probably the most important part, it is a cornerstone of good strength conditioning practice and coaching, is to base your prescriptions for exercises and programming off of a needs analysis. And that is exactly what it sounds like. A needs analysis is just considering what your athlete needs in their sport to be successful. And you look at that, or you can formulate that by looking at the demands of the sport that your athlete participates in. So you'd look at the biomechanical and physiological needs. And that simplifies even more to what kind of movements does your athlete perform? At what intensity do they perform them at? What kind of energy system are they using? Is it a very short, sharp, intense effort, or is it a long, drawn out, more endurance based, or is it a mixture of both, like boxing, where you do have those moments, those movements where you're using high force at high rates, but they're repeated efforts over the course of however many rounds, 3-minute rounds for, 8, 10, 12 rounds potentially at the highest level. And so you have to consider this before you even attempt to prescribe exercises and programming. You need to consider what kind of movements are being done and how are they being done, for how long, and so on. Also, injury risk, that of course plays a role too, is very important, because ultimately, as a strength conditioning coach, your job is to enhance your athlete's ability, their performance. So it's performance enhancement and injury risk reduction. You want to allow your athlete to train and compete while reducing the risk of injury. Simple as that. Everything else is just detail. So if we look at chopping down a tree and we isolate it, because I don't know the context of Anthony Joshua's training. You know, I can tell you how far away he is from fight night, but I'm not sure right now what kind of phase of training he's in. Maybe his training isn't even structured. I don't know. So, but because I don't know these things, I don't have the proper context. However, I'm going to isolate the practice of chopping wood, chopping down a tree, and provide you that scientific underpinning, if you like. So, if we look at the action of swinging an axe into a tree, now you don't just extend at the elbow and hit the axe into the tree in a linear head-on fashion. There's a swinging motion, there's a large rotational swing to it, and that is probably the cornerstone of that movement, and that's also a very important feature within boxing. I've outlined I've outlined this in previous videos where I've given like a biomechanical assessment of punching in boxing and how to punch powerfully and forcefully. And so we have in boxing, good striking, effective striking has a considerable rotational aspect to it. Now, there is variation amongst the type of punch you're using. Punches like jabs and crosses in particular, they still have that rotational aspect. It's still present, but it's not as large, it's not as considerable as the rotational aspect in more hooking punches. And, you know, hooking punches are inherently more angular. They follow a circular pathway and trajectory rather than the kind of linear or curvilinear trajectory of, say, a straight cross. So we can see that there is some carryover from swinging an axe to punching, especially hooking punches, because of that large rotational aspect and looking to generate force in that rotational movement pattern. Now, there are some very knowledgeable and well-respected S&C coaches who kind of reject, and they don't think too highly of training rotational power in a strength and conditioning setting. They think that, and they suggest that if you're an athlete and you already are forceful and strong and powerful and you can generate high amounts of force very quickly, you don't really need to focus on additional work in a rotational fashion. Because you already have those qualities, you should then focus on your sport-specific movements, which are likely to be rotational, in this case boxing. And then you should refine your rotational power output in the sport-specific setting. And that's a very valid point. That's very receivable. I understand that. But I think there is value in this kind of activity, chopping a tree, and there's value in variation, but I'll get to that. Because as I say, it's a receivable point because you can get to the point of being too specific. Although, is chopping down a tree too specific? I don't think so, because chopping a tree still remains chopping a tree. But it does come with some added benefits, because if you think you're swinging this axe with a lot of force at a high velocity, eventually, assuming that your accuracy isn't absolutely abysmal and you miss the tree, that axe is going to go into the tree and there's going to be some force. I want to avoid using overly technical terms because I understand not everyone here is into biomechanics and physics and strength conditioning. So I'm just going to simplify it. You swing that axe very hard, very fast, it goes into the tree. There's going to be a reaction that comes back. There's going to be force from that impact that comes back towards you. And now, for you guys who have ever swung a sledgehammer trying to knock something down, or you swung an axe into a tree trying to chop something, you'll know that that force comes back. And if you're not prepared for it, if you kind of relax and go a bit loose and limp as it makes impact, it can be quite jolting. It can jar your joints a little bit. And you very quickly realize that, okay, I can't just relax once I've swung this axe. I need to actually brace a bit. I need to absorb that force and have a degree of rigidity. And the same applies to boxing, because I've established in previous videos how to generate power and force in your punches, you need to accelerate your body mass. You need to accelerate your body mass, because we know force equals mass times acceleration. So all you're doing in boxing is you're accelerating that body mass across your stance, and you're looking to make an impact on your target and inflict that force and inflict damage. Imagine if we accelerate our body mass with great technique, but our hand is just limp and loose, and our wrist isn't tense, just completely limp. We make contact. You're probably going to injure yourself and damage yourself more than you damage your opponent, no matter how quickly you accelerate your body mass across your body to throw that punch. The impact is terrible. That's why you make a fist. That's why you really clench, so you can make a good impact. It's something called effective mass. It's a concept in physics, but it carries over to boxing, because effective mass, are you using your mass effectively? Are you able to accelerate your weight and then transmit that force into the target without it almost rebounding towards you? You want to be able to be rigid and absorb any returning force, and have that rigidity so that all the force transmits into the target and does damage in that direction you're punching, and not come back to you. That is what effective mass is in simple terms. And so you can once again see there's a carryover between swinging an axe into a massive tree that's obviously going to outweigh you, by a crazy amount, but you learn to be rigid on impact and absorb any force, and condition your body to not only produce the force through swinging the axe, but absorb any returning force. Because one of the most enlightening things I ever learned about biomechanics and sports and strength conditioning is that you can essentially break a lot of movements down and a lot of sporting actions to producing force and then absorbing it. But those qualities are so important, but a lot of the time we only see people learning to produce force and they never absorb it. So it's part of being resilient, it's part of being a good athlete. But I could go on about that. There are so many sporting examples, but the punching example, punching and landing with a rigid body really, but especially in the fist and the wrist and so on, very important. You need a strong kinetic chain for impact. This is a bit more anecdotal, but talking about the room for variation, I'm someone who and I'm no Anthony Joshua, you guys know this, I'm just making these silly little videos from my home on my laptop, but I box for a fair while, and I have some fairly deformed knuckles, and this leads them to bruise quite easily. And so I can lay into a heavy bag and get the same benefits ostensibly from a transfer point of view. If we look at the biomechanics of it and conditioning the body, I can probably get the same benefits from wood chopping and tree chopping from hitting the heavy bag. But of course, hitting the heavy bag is much more specific. It's hitting the heavy bag, using your sport specific movements of striking and developing them and your athletic capacities that way. But see, if I hit the heavy bag, and this is just me, I'm not a world level fighter by any means, just someone who boxed for a few years. If I hit the heavy bag for 2 hours, my knuckles are bruised quite badly. Even if I wear wraps, even if I wear my very comfortable Rival gloves, which are, I think they're high density foam, so they're really dense, really cushioned on the inside, my knuckles are still bruised. Just the shape of them leads them to bruise really easily. And I can't hit the heavy bag for 2 weeks probably. So I need to fit in variations of shadow boxing, pad work, that kind of stuff. I can't just rely on the heavy bag and lay into it multiple times a week like I could when I was a teenager. Now that's just me. There's possibility that Anthony Joshua has this issue, or other fighters have this issue. So still focusing on developing that rotational force output, it has value in my opinion, because sometimes you can only lay into the heavy bag so much. But that being said, I've given a bit of anecdotal evidence and some biomechanical and strength and conditioning evidence, there is also more to it, because if we look at the realms of boxing now, there's a lot that goes into being a big puncher. There's a lot that goes into being a knockout artist, and a lot of it is kind of separate to, or it's beyond how much force you can produce and how much power you can produce in your punches. So there's a psychological aspect, a large psychological aspect. We know that boxing as a whole, there's a large psychological component of it, because boxing is one of those things where it's quite a freestyle sport. You can essentially do whatever you want as long as it's in the rules, and you have a lot of room. It's like, okay, 3 minutes, go, do what you feel you need to do. Once again, as long as it's legal and within the rules of boxing. But we've seen time and time again how the mindset of a fighter can determine their performance and their style in the ring. And if you're a fighter like Anthony Joshua, who's maybe lacking confidence, that's certainly been a theme of recent years, of Anthony Joshua not being fully immersed in the moment, seemingly battling some demons and not having entirely not having 100% confidence. That can affect your ability, because if you're not entirely confident, how are you going to really commit yourself to your movements? How are you going to commit with a lot of force? How are you going to commit to trying to damage your opponent? So it doesn't really matter how much force you can generate in your punches. If you're not willing to actually use that force and express it, I don't think you're going to be knocking anyone out. Or the rate at which you knock people out and do damage is probably going to decrease quite significantly. But then that's the psychological aspect. If we look at the technical and tactical aspect, if you're a fighter, and there have been plenty of fighters over the years who, on record, people tell you they punch really hard, but they don't necessarily have the technique or the application of their technique. They don't set up their shots very well, and they very rarely catch opponents clean, because there's the application of that punching technique, which is very powerful. It's just the application isn't very intelligent, and so they don't land that consistently, and then they don't hurt people consistently. They don't knock people out consistently, and even if they do have intelligent application of it, there are other factors such as distance, positioning. If they're a great puncher but they smother themselves too much, or they struggle at long range so they can't land flush on the target with enough force, or if the opponent is quite defensively astute and they're able to cut the punch off in a certain trajectory, or move their head, or block it, something like that. So they're always preventing that fighter who's very powerful from landing cleanly. There are so many aspects that go into being powerful and strong and a knockout artist, and strength conditioning will develop those capacities from a biomechanical, an athletic perspective. But of course, there is the sport-specific, or the importance of the sport-specific development, technically, tactically, and of course, psychologically. So I feel like I've covered a lot of bases. I've given you guys a lot of information in this one, and I hope it's been enjoyable. I hope it's been insightful, and I guess this kind of opens up the doors. If you guys have any questions regarding strength conditioning and the practices, leave them in the comment section below, because I'll be more than happy to do videos and answer them. Hopefully, as I say, dispel some of the myths and misconceptions surrounding strength conditioning, and maybe open some people's eyes up. I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm very much on a journey of learning myself, but all I hope to do is, give you my 2 cents. You can take it or leave it, but hopefully it helps you to find your own answers and come to your own conclusions. But I'm going to leave it there for this one, folks. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you. But for now, thanks for listening as always, and I'll catch you on the next video.